Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Thomas Raysmith, lecturer in philosophy at the Bard College in Berlin. And we're talking about his book, Hegel and the Problem of the History of Philosophy, the Logical Structure of Exemplarity. Dr. Raysmith, wonderful to have you on today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Dr. Raysmith, why this book? Hegel constantly attracts another book. Like, you felt like you had something to add. Why this book on Hegel?
Yeah, obviously there's a wealth of books on Hegel out there. I'm particularly interested in methodologies in philosophy. So, oftentimes you find in, for instance, some strains of analytic philosophy, there isn't really a concern with methodology, but rather with making claims, providing arguments for those claims, but not with, for instance, seeing how those claims link together with other more distant claims, and whether they also accord with the methodologies that the philosophers in making them are applying. So I'm particularly interested in methodologies of philosophy, and methodologies of doing history of philosophy. I'm concerned with questions concerning whether there can indeed be a history of philosophy. So some people have a particular picture of philosophy or a definition of philosophy. Then they might go on to talk about the history of philosophy, the history of ideas, but the definition seems to exclude the possibility of there indeed being a history of philosophy. Hegel was particularly sensitive to this problem. He wasn't the first by any means, and indeed people around his time in Germany were concerned with the question of whether there can be a history of philosophy, and what sort of conception of philosophy you need to have in order for that possibility to be there. And one of those people is Kant, and so famously Kant, but also Schelling and Fichte, and then some lesser known figures like Reinhold, popularizer of Kant's philosophy, and people like Feuilleborn. But Hegel really does concern himself with this question: how can there be a history of philosophy? What sort of conception of philosophy do we need to have such that a history is possible? Because he thinks that there is a history. And so he makes this question quite explicit in his lectures on the history of philosophy. He brings up the question of the history of philosophy many times in other works as well. And I was just trying to really get clear on what his conception of philosophy is, and how it makes a history of philosophy possible, because he thinks it does. So the more I read, the more I realized that there hadn't been. There are some people working on this, but it seems to be a relatively overlooked area of Hegel's philosophy, which is interesting because he lectured on the history of philosophy many times, and he was particularly concerned with trying to explain what's going on in the history of philosophy, and there is a lot of focus on his lectures on the history of philosophy, but not on the question of how there can be a history of philosophy. So
not what he was using his work for, other than what he was attempting to do. If you don't mind, just to kind of set up before we move to talking about Hegel, if we could set this up a little bit, what would be a kind of classic example? Because on the face of it, I don't think most people would understand the claim that there couldn't be a history of philosophy. What would be an argument? What's one of the more famous arguments? Or, if you want to go to two, that's fine. That would exclude the history of philosophy.
So perhaps the best one to mention here is Kant's conception of philosophy. I mean, this is the one I talk about in the book. With an asterisk, because at one point Kant does countenance the possibility of a history of philosophy. But in his critical works, so the critiques, he outlines this conception of philosophy, according to which philosophy is essentially just a set of ahistorical, a priori principles. And if that is all philosophy is, if it is just a set of a priori principles, then there is no history. It's an a priori structure, and that's it. It's static as well, so it's not developmental. It's just a set of propositions that are static. So while there might be for Kant a history of philosophizing, that is attempts at developing a system of propositions, because those propositions aren't the propositions he comes up with, they're essentially misguided, and they are just ideas. They're not actually adding to the system of philosophy. So for Kant, there's a history of philosophizing, but there is no history of philosophy. Philosophy is limited to his critical system, and it's just a set of metaphysical a priori propositions that he hits on, or he thinks he hits on,
So if you don't mind me talking through this a little bit, so this is where he'll talk about what you're referencing is him kind of talking about like the history of metaphysics, and he talks about metaphysics kind of in a derogatory tone, right?
Yeah.
People, and with this, so in his mind, it'd be like we have a histories of mathematics, but you don't have to study the history of mathematics. Like it's more like it's of special interest. It's kind of like a niche interest, but it has nothing to do with the actual practice of mathematics. Would that be a way of thinking about it?
To begin with, it could be, yeah. So there's a difference here, though, in that we would often talk about. I mean, mathematics is a good example, but maybe the history of science will make things a little clearer.
Yeah.
Oftentimes we can talk about. I mean, I teach the history of science, and we can talk about the history of science. And often it's when we teach that or think about that, we're thinking about the history of a practice or something. And it clearly has a history there, right? People engaged in one common project, perhaps. I mean, there are varying projects, but but there seems to be, because it can be accounted for in terms of a practice or a project, there's a history to that project. And of course, you don't need to study the history of science. I mean, it might help, but you could just dive right in, right, and study contemporary science. But philosophy, for Kant, just is this static set of principles. That's all philosophy is. And he thinks that these principles are derived from human reason, which has certain fundamental principles, and he thinks that there's only one human reason. It's always the same. So then the propositions that you derive from it, if you give a proper analysis of human reason, will always be the same propositions, and there'll be this set of a priori ahistorical propositions, and there is no, because philosophy in that respect is not regarded as a project, but as a system, a static system. It has no history. But philosophizing, or the project of coming up with a philosophy or trying to hit on these principles of reason, that has a history. But Kant thinks that's not a history of philosophy. That's just a history of philosophizing. It's a history of a project. But the project is distinct. The project that aims at developing a philosophy, that is distinct from philosophy itself. And he is derogatory about the history of metaphysics. You're right. And he, I think, explaining why that's the case also helps explain why there's no history of philosophy. He thinks basically that the history of metaphysics is a history of failed attempts, right? He calls them like ruined edifices or something. That history is made up of ruined edifices, and so it's more like a history of ideas, but they're not hitting on any truths. They're not getting at the truth, and philosophy is supposed to get at the truth, whatever that truth is. But because they don't get that truth, they're not really philosophy. It's just a history of failed ideas, and that's distinct from philosophy itself.
Because philosophy isn't a failure; it's a complete system.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes total sense. One, thank you. Very gracious setting that up. You're obviously here to talk about Hegel. So let me ask you, now that we've kind of set the stage for what Hegel's working against, what is he attempting to do in his lectures and his works on the history of philosophy?
Good question. What is he attempting to do? I think he's maybe the best way of setting this up is to point out the reason that Hegel thinks philosophy has a history. So for Hegel, philosophy is the expression of something, which I will no doubt get into as we go along. But this thing is the idea, what he calls the idea. But philosophy is the expression of the idea in the element of human conceptual thought. More specifically, human thought that is about human thought. So it's reflexive, it's self-reflexive. And Hegel thinks that human conceptual thought is always historically determined and situated, culturally and historically determined and situated. We build our concepts from previous concepts. We critique previous concepts and come up with new ones. We refine them. Basic refinement you can note in the sciences or in biology, in particular. What certain species are. The definitions get refined over time. So for Hegel, human conceptual thought is always historically determined and situated, and that means, because philosophy is always in the element of human conceptual thought, it is always historically determined and situated, culturally and historically determined and situated. And I think what he's trying to do in the lectures on the history of philosophy is give an account of the process of determination of human conceptual thought. There's a bit more to it in that, what he's trying to, once you look at the logic and you see what philosophy is for Hegel, what's supposed to be expressed, I think he's trying to then also show that it is in all cases an expression of the idea, but we can get into that as we go along.
So I think for some people who are not familiar with Hegel's thought, I know that this is what I was originally taught when I first heard about Hegel. The first thing everyone brings up, and I've heard is a classic misconception, is the thesis, antithesis, synthesis process. And they're like, oh, that's Hegel's main thing. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that is actually the foundation of Hegel's thought. Or how did that misconception kind of start? What did can you talk us through why that might not be the case?
It's not the case. Yeah. How it began, it was a derogatory depiction of Hegel's philosophy. It was an oversimplified picture of Hegel's philosophy. I'm sure there'll be some Hegelians who, if I get this wrong, will correct me, but I think it may have been Schopenhauer. Not a fan of Hegel.
Later, Dr. Raysmith would email me and tell me it's Heinrich Moritz Schelebeo.
And it was essentially supposed to sort of point out it was used to point out the ridiculousness of Hegel's philosophy, but it is highly inaccurate. I mean, it's just not the case that as you progress through Hegel's work, you always find thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Sometimes you find, I mean, particularly in the logic, first of all, I don't think the logic is really putting forward theses. It's just a logical structure showing itself. So it's inaccurate for that reason. But also, what you often find is that you get some determination, some Bestimmung in the logic, and then it's not even the case that it's antithesis or it's the directly opposed determination arises from it, but more like a contrary determination or something. And then while it is true that in the logic, the later determinations always sort of sublate the former determinations, take up, negate, preserve in some fashion. It's not always the case that it's a synthesis of so-called thesis and antithesis. It's often a new determination. I mean, it doesn't come from nothing, but it's sort of a new determination altogether. It's not simply just a combination or a synthesis of previous determinations.
And I might be barking up the wrong tree entirely. Feel free to ignore this question. Would it be helpful to talk about the distinction between sublation and synthesis?
We can, if you like. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
That might, because I think, because when you talk about it sublating it, it's like, well, they go into it. Isn't that synthesizing? But I feel like there is a difference there. Would defining those two be helpful?
Sure. Yeah. So sublation, to sublate, aufheben, it's to take something up. So that it's got a dual sense. It's sort of to take something up and cancel it, but also to take something up and preserve it. And so what happens in the logic is that you find that early determinations get cancelled in that they seemed to be something often, particularly in the early parts of the logic, they seemed to be sort of standalone notions. They seemed to be independent in some fashion. And then it turns out that they're not. They can only they're only maintained in relation to some other determination. And so in that way, those early determinations as independent determinations are cancelled. They're no longer seen as independent. They're preserved in that they now appear in relation to some other determination or as part of some other determination. The different ways in which they are preserved change. But so they're preserved, but they're also they're no longer what they once were. And then they're also made as they're sort of redetermined as moments, sort of incomplete specifications or something of some larger determination. So they're no longer independent, cancelled as independent, cancelled as standalone. They then appear as sort of one part of something larger, or in relation to something else, and then they are determined as a moment of something more. And in that sense, it's similar to, it might sound similar to a synthesis, what you get at the end. But with a synthesis, you could say, to use again Kant as an example here, when we're coming up with empirical concepts, when we're creating empirical concepts, we can take certain conceptual marks. So my mug, which I'm drinking some tea out of here at the moment, one mark is I chose the wrong mug because the color's a bit odd, but it's like a bluey gray, or a grayish blue. So one mark of my mug is that it's that color. Another is that it has a certain shape, that it's a receptacle. We combine all of those and get the concept of this particular type of mug, right? What happens there, though, is that those conceptual marks just remain as they were. They're just combined with something else. So the grayish blue remains the same notion that it was before. The shape or the form remains the same as it was before. The notion of a receptacle remains the same. But with Hegel, the early determinations do not remain as they once were. They are altered in some way.
So my background, for those who have listened to the podcast, you're tired of me saying this, but for each guest, it's it's new. My background's in hermeneutic philosophy. So, and of course, Gadamer, very familiar with Hegel. He talks about the work of art as this historical object, and that it changes over time. So, for instance, you have a painting that is done for a nobleman, and then it gets stolen in wartime, and now it's like it's loot, right? So it starts out as decoration, starts out as wealth and prestige, and becomes plunder, and then it ends up in a museum and ends up being like a national relic, right?
Yep.
And so in each case, it is preserved, but it's becoming something totally different. That's not, it's not getting synthesized. It's getting, is that a version of sublation?
That's a nice example. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which I was reading, and I did this backwards. I was reading Gadamer before I read Hegel, so I did not think about it until you were describing it. I was like, oh, he's just using Hegel. That makes total sense.
He is using Hegel, and so he is definitely using Hegel here. Hegel, this is directly related to Hegel's account of action. So Hegel, for Hegel, when we talk about a person's action, what they've done, it would be incorrect to think of an action as completely defined by some sort of atomic description of it at the time that it occurs. For Hegel, an action gets redetermined as time goes on and interpretations change, but also as its effects play out. One example that's thrown around a lot here is the French Revolution. I mean, what the French Revolution is still being determined. We're yet to see, right? That's one of the claims. For Hegel, there are some, and this also plays a role in determining what somebody is responsible for. So there are certain effects that a person either can or should be able to see as what will result from their action, and then they should be held accountable for those, perhaps. But then there are some that they can't see, and they can't be expected to have seen. You could, I don't know, throw a ball, and you're trying to throw it to your friend, and your friend doesn't catch it, and it goes behind them. Somebody trips and then breaks their ankle on it, right? Probably couldn't have foreseen that. Shouldn't be expected to have foreseen that. Nonetheless, it's an effect.
Yeah. And I think there's something to be said too. And maybe I'm groping blindly here, right? But there's also this idea of like, you can't. This is a common thing as you grow older to look back, and with the wisdom that you have won, reinterpret and that, man, if I should have done that, but that's only possible because you went through the thing. And so it's not, so there's that, there's not only that responsibility piece, there's that understanding piece, that historical, and I know that we've kind of taken, in some ways, a detour here, but this feels like it's really central to discussing, like, why is Hegel obsessed with history? This seems to make sense.
Yeah. And he goes back and rewrites his histories many times over because, as he gets older, there's more to add, and there are new interpretations to be had, and so and often with certain philosophers, right, rewriting part of your system might lead to inconsistencies, and that would be a problem. But I think that with Hegel, the rewriting is part of the account. So this is the point about, this is why he's studying history philosophy, to look at the ways in which human conceptual thought is determined over time. And so, the history of philosophy needs to be retold all the time, because the concepts that you use to tell it get redetermined or refined, or new ones, are created, or whatever. So for him, there are certainly some inconsistencies, but the fact that he rewrites, and the fact that that history is rewritable is not a problem for Hegel. That is precisely the point.
So how does that, to bring it full, like we're 25 minutes in, you've been very patient. How does that relate to the logical structure of exemplarity?
Right.
Did I say it right? I'm still working on that.
No, you've said it right. So this is the name that I give it. It's and I give it that name. So first of all, Karen Ung, great Hegel scholar, she wrote a book, Hegel's Concept of Life. Brilliant. Everybody should read that. In that work, she points out that with Hegel's discussion of judgment at the end of the Logic, there's a form of judgment in which singular things and with their particular constitutions are exemplars of some concept. And so partially the name, the structure of exemplarity that I've given to what Hegel calls the idea comes from reading Karen Ung, but it's also it comes from my work on Wittgenstein and his notion of samples or exemplars, Muster in German. Essentially, a sample for Wittgenstein. I mean, the famous one is the meter rod in Paris, which was the standard, right, for a meter at his time. For Wittgenstein, you can't say of the meter rod that it either is or is not 1 meter long, because for something to be 1 meter long is for it to be like the meter rod with respect to length, and it can't be like itself because you can't compare it to itself. So a sample or an exemplar is this thing for Wittgenstein, and I think that the structure of the idea, the logical structure of the idea, is exhibited in a Wittgensteinian sample. I don't know if we want to discuss that, or I talk more about what the logic is first and why I think which would be more helpful, do you think, for your listeners? Do I talk about what the logic's role is and then go into this structure, or?
I do feel like this is a question of method, right? Like, are we going to start from the end and work backwards, or are we going to tell it like a narrative? Please, whichever you prefer.
Okay, I'll start with what the logic is and what its role is in Hegel's system, and then I'll be able to say, I think, more about why it has this role by referring to the structure of exemplarity, or the idea. So For so what the logic is, as I read it, it's this expression of a purely logical structure. It's a very complex logical structure. I mean, it stretches over hundreds of pages. I mean, the exhibition of it stretches over hundreds of pages. So it's obviously complex, but it is a unified logical structure that unfolds. It's developmental. And there are a couple of things to say about it that before I can say why it has this particular role in Hegel's system. So this logical structure for Hegel, it develops itself to completion solely from its own resources. So it has a beginning, which is a big problem for Hegel scholars, what that beginning is, how we make sense of it. But it has a beginning. You get an initial determination, pure being, which turns into nothingness, or it not turns into, but a new determination, nothingness arises from it in some fashion. And then determinations unfold, arise from one another, and until the point at which this structure exhausts itself and comprehends itself in its totality. And because it does all of this solely from its own resources and independently of anything else. So there are some readings of the logic that that suggest that the logic is motivated by our attempt to apply the determinations, or as some people call them, the categories, in thought or in judgment. So Robert Pippin is an example of a person who thinks this. He thinks that basically we attempt to apply the determination of pure being in thought. We realize it's basically empty, and so then we end up with this notion of nothingness, and then we go on from there. I don't think, Hegel's pretty clear that the logic can't be motivated like that. So I don't think that's the right way to read this. I think that the logic has to be read so that we see this logical structure as developing without any influence from anything else, without any motivation from anything else. It's just this logical structure unfolding itself by itself, solely from its own resources. And because it brings itself to completion or exhausts itself without any need of anything else, it is then unlimited. It's not limited by anything else. And because it's not limited by anything else, it then also must express itself in everything. Were there to be something in nature or in culture or in history that did not express some part of this logical structure, then that thing would limit the logical structure. And that would determine the logical structure, and that's exactly what the logic is supposed to show isn't the case. So this logical structure exhibits moments of itself in everything. So it's the fundamental structure of everything, the fundamental logical structure of everything. It's incredibly skeletal or poor. We can't, for instance, derive anything from it, really. We can't say what the future is going to hold, or to use the famous example, you can't derive a pen in my room from it, right? All it allows for is that once something happens, once history plays out, once a natural event occurs or whatever, we can know, having studied the logic, that what has occurred will be an expression of this logical structure, or some moment of this logical structure, because it's the fundamental structure of everything. So for Hegel, the logic is the foundation of his entire system, because once he's shown that this is the fundamental structure of everything, what he can then do is show how it gets expressed. So what its expressions look like in history. So when he's going through the history of philosophy, what he's showing is that moments of this structure have been expressed in the element of human conceptual thought that is self-reflexive, and then this is what it looks like, and because everything is an expression of this logical structure, including our thought, everything is intelligible. There is no limit to what we can know. There is nothing that's out of bounds to knowledge. And also, we can say that philosophy, the history of philosophy, is in some sense unified because it's all an expression of this same thing, which is, for Hegel, that one truth, the big truth that philosophy is supposed to be getting at. So for Hegel, the history of philosophy just is this unified expression, unified. It is unified expressions of the idea, or moments of the idea, in the element of human thought that's reflected on itself. And then he talks about, philosophy of nature and philosophy of Geist, spirit, and all of these are just different expressions of the same thing, of the idea. They are expressions in different elements. But because they're all expressions of the same thing, and they must be, given what the logic is supposed to show, Hegel thinks that he's got a system, a unified system of knowledge, basically.
When you're talking about the fundamental structure of everything, that this is the logical structure, the structure of the logic, is that the working out of the idea then? Is that kind of the, so for him, everything is summed up in the idea, which I think we're now going to talk about, but it's that he's basically unpacking that.
Yes.
Okay. So the end goal of all this is the idea.
Yeah.
Which is everything.
Yeah. You can only say this. Which is everything. You can only say this once you get to the end of the logic. So you can only say this once you've gone through the logic. Then you can say, all of that was an unpacking of the idea, because the idea, of course, doesn't arise until the end of the logic. And because we can't motivate the logic, we can't say from the start, the point is to get to the idea. Let's try to get there. What determination should we posit next? We just sort of have to look on as this idea unfolds itself. And then when we get to the end, we say, that was the idea. If we look back now, we see that it was just the unfolding of this thing all along.
Which, as we said before, is the great synthesis, right? That's the...
Yeah, I mean, it's not really a synthesis.
Sorry, that was a joke. That was... I couldn't resist. I apologize.
Yeah.
So, okay. So, apologies for the distraction. When you're talking about the idea, this is the culmination that unfolds after. So, is it possible to understand what Hegel's saying without reading the several hundred pages that unpack the logic?
No.
This explains why. Yeah. Explains why people prefer the thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's much easier. Yeah, I mean, I had an interesting experience when I was trying to write this book, which started off as my PhD dissertation, although it was basically completely rewritten by the time it got to the publication phase. But you find a lot of Hegel scholars just beginning their discussions of the logic with the subjective logic, and which is the end part, right? It's whereas Hegel's talking about judgments and syllogisms, and and the idea, and so you find a lot of people starting there, and I really tried. I thought if I can just start there, that would be great. But I kept coming across this problem where I realized that, well, if I'm going to mention this determination, but then there's no way of talking about what that determination is or unpacking that determination without going back, because it's a redetermination of an earlier determination. That's the case with the logic. Every later determination is a redetermination of some earlier determination. So the logical structure that unfolds is a structure of determinations that are co-determining, and so. But yeah, every single later determination, all the ones you find in the later part of the in the later parts of the work, they're all redeterminations of something that comes earlier. So I just kept finding myself being pushed further and further back, and then I went, well, okay, why not just start at the start? Yeah.
Forgive me. And so I'm just trying to understand this, though. Are the determinations and the way that this unfolds, this plan that he has, this path, this path of this unfolding, is this it's working out in a historical way, and so you could have an alternative path, or is it universal, kind of transcendent, like it always has to work out according to these determinations?
So the exhibition of the determinations, that's historically situated and determined. It requires conceptual thought. So the form of the expression of the idea can change over time.
For instance, like I mean, that's why otherwise you couldn't translate it. It'd be almost like Holy Writ, right? Like obviously historical. Okay, so like it's written in German, it would show up in English. Okay,
so the same thing is expressing or showing itself in German and English and every other language. So the expression of the thing, of the idea, can change over time, and in fact has to change over time. But the logical structure itself, which is a developmental processual structure, that is atemporal. That's outside of space and time, atemporal, non-spatial. Indeed, it's the fundamental logical structure of everything that is spatiotemporal. Everything that is spatiotemporal is an expression of this logical structure, and so then it's logically prior to all of them. It exists in a purely logical realm, so to speak, but it expresses itself in the spatiotemporal realm.
Did you call it the processive structure? What was that P word that you said?
It's processual.
Processual. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's a process, and it's developmental. Unlike, for instance, Kant's static propositions or principles, they're not developmental. They just are. But the whole idea for Hegel just sort of is. It's outside of space and time, but it is developmental, and that means that its expressions will also be developmental.
And this is it. So if I understand why you're bringing in Wittgenstein and the meter rod, you can't jump to the end. You can't skip the process because the process is the thing. Is that kind of the idea that you're getting at?
That's the thing. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at. So that doesn't have so much to do with Wittgenstein, but you can't jump to the end precisely because the end is a redetermination of everything that came before it. So you don't get a lot of information if you just jump to the end. So if I just tell you what those determinations are, you can say, well, okay, but what's that determination? Like, well, go one back and then it's this. And, okay, but then what's that one? You go one back again. All right. It's a redetermination of this thing. It's a redetermination of this thing. Eventually you get to the beginning, and So a lot of Hegel scholars do try to just jump forward to the end. That's fine. But I think it also is one of the reasons that there are some confusing and I think incorrect statements about what's going on in the end of the logic. Sometimes it's they sort of resort to explaining what's going on in terms of spatiotemporal expressions of the thing, the idea. So a judgment is just, something we express in language, but that's not precisely. I mean, that's not correct when we're talking about the logic. The judgment is a particular logical structure. It gets expressed in language and thought, but it would be incorrect to say that Hegel is concerned with the expressions in the logic. What he's concerned with is this logical structure of judgment, and not its expression. And sometimes people make an equation, and I think that's it's a false equivalence.